Oswald's nitrates test. Did it prove anything? On the evening of the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was given a paraffin nitrates test by Dallas crime investigator W.E. Pete Barnes. The test was performed by Barnes in Captain Fritz's office, where the interview of Oswald was in progress. The hallways of the police department were crowded with dozens of news reporters, so it was decided not to move Oswald upstairs to the crime lab for the test for security reasons. Listen as Detective Barnes gives his Warren Commission testimony and explains to the Commissioner, Attorney Bellin, how he went about doing this. Detective Barnes says, "We got our equipment and got the paraffin melted, and while it was being prepared, we told him that we would have to make a paraffin cast of his hand." Mr. Bellin asks, what did he say to that? That is, what did Oswald say to that? Detective Barnes says it was okay with him. Mr. Bellin says, did he say anything as to any other comments that he had about the paraffin test? Mr. Barnes, none other than he stated, what are you trying to do, prove that I fired a gun? And I said, I'm not trying to prove that you fired a gun. We have this test that we need to make, and the chemical people at the laboratory and the city-county laboratory will determine the rest of it. Then Mr. Bellin asks, what was the purpose of the paraffin test? Mr. Barnes, the purpose is to find out if there was any nitrates on their hands. Mr. Bellin, officer, how many years have you personally made paraffin tests? Mr. Barnes answers, since 1956. Mr. Bellin, what is the procedure by which you determine whether or not there are any nitrates on one's hands? Mr. Barnes, the analyses are made at Parkland Hospital by their personnel. Mr. Bellin, do they analyze the wax? Mr. Barnes, they analyze the wax that I remove from his hands after the casts are made. Mr. Bellin then asks, is it hot wax that is poured onto the hands? And Detective Barnes explains, well, it wouldn't be hot wax. It would have to be a degree where it would be melted. Then we take a small paintbrush, a small little brush, and dip it into the paraffin, and we paint the hand as you would be painting a wall, and you build this paraffin wax up around the hand, front and back, until you get a layer approximately 1/4 of an inch thick. Then you wrap the hands in gauze, just a layer of gauze around it for reinforcement purposes, such as you would put a steel and concrete to reinforce it. And then on top of this gauze, we put another layer of paraffin. In fact, several layers of paraffin on top of the gauze to round it out and make it more firm, so that when we remove this paraffin from around his hands, we take a pair of surgical scissors and cut down each side, and it slips off just like you were removing a glove. When you put the paraffin on your hand, the nitrates that might be on your hands will stick to the paraffin as it cools. And when you remove the paraffin, then this nitrate or powder residue, which might be on the hands, will be hardened into the paraffin and will slip off with the paraffin. That is why they call this the dermal nitrate test. I believe that's the correct name that they give it. Mr. Bellin asks, does gunpowder generally have included in it some sort of nitrate compound? Mr. Barnes answers, yes. Mr. Bellin, if I were firing a pistol, would this pistol leave a nitrate on my hands that would be detectable by the paraffin test? Mr. Barnes answer, it should, unless it was awful tight. Bellin, what do you mean by awful tight? Mr. Barnes, you could have an automatic, which would very easily keep you from having nitrates on your hands. Well, let's assume that we were talking about a .38 caliber pistol. You've seen the pistol which Lee Harvey Oswald had in his possession at the time he was apprehended. Let's assume we were firing that pistol. Would it leave some residue on my hand if I shot from it? Mr. Barnes answer, it should. Mr. Bellin says, all right, now suppose you were to examine me for firing a rifle, such as a bolt-action rifle, rather than a pistol. Would you expect to find nitrate residue on my hands that a paraffin test would show? Detective Barnes says, chances are smaller on a rifle than it would be with a revolver. Mr. Bellin asks, why? Mr. Barnes, because your chamber is enclosed. Mr. Bellin continues, what difference does that make? Mr. Barnes says, the powder couldn't get out like a pistol where the cylinder is open, and there's no casing around the cylinder of a revolver. And the chamber of a rifle, it's enclosed with the metal all the way around. Well, I operate the bolt of the rifle. Does that make a difference about letting the gas in or residue escape? Mr. Barnes replies, no, all your explosives have already gone down the barrel. It's not coming down the side when you operate the chamber. There is no pressure there. Mr. Bellin, what you're saying then is that it is the pressure at the time of the firing in an open chamber that creates the major portion of this residue? And Mr. Barnes says that's right. Bellin says, when you take a usual paraffin test, do you take it on any other part of the body other than the hands? Mr. Barnes says no. Bellin, in this case, did you take it of any other portion of the body other than the hands? Barnes says, yes, I did. What other portion of the body did you take it on? Mr. Barnes says, the right side of his cheek and face. Bellin asks, the right side of Lee Harvey Oswald's cheek and face? Barnes, yes. Mr. Bellin, who directed you to take it there? Mr. Barnes says, Captain Fritz. Bellin, did he particularly say that he wanted it taken there? Mr. Barnes, I didn't ask questions why he wanted it. I was ordered to take it from him, and I took it because I had the order to take the test. Mr. Bellin, was there an order to take the left cheek also or not? Mr. Barnes, no. Mr. Bellin, how long did you say that you had been making paraffin tests? Mr. Barnes answered, since 1956. Mr. Bellin, roughly how many of those do you think you do in a month on an average? I can say that I have made many over a period of time. Mr. Bellin, over these years, do you think you have made as many as 100? Mr. Barnes, it would be hard to say. I'm not going to go into any actual figures because it would be just guesswork. Mr. Bellin, well, let me ask you this. Of the paraffin tests that you have made, how many have you made on a cheek or cheeks? Mr. Barnes, 1. Mr. Bellin, was that with Lee Harvey Oswald? Mr. Barnes says, yes, it was. Mr. Bellin, other than that, you have never made a paraffin test on anyone's cheek? Mr. Barnes answers, no. Mr. Bellin, any particular reason why you might not have in any other case? Mr. Barnes, has never been requested of me before. Mr. Bellin, based on your knowledge and information about the science of paraffin tests, do you know whether or not it is common practice or not common practice to make it of one cheek? Mr. Barnes answered, it is not a common practice. Mr. Bellin, any particular reason it is not a common practice that you can think of or know of? So Mr. Barnes says, well, firing a revolver, I would say that the revolver most likely would be far enough away that the powder residue wouldn't reach his cheek. Well, what about a rifle? Mr. Barnes, firing a rifle, you get your chamber enclosed with steel metal around it, and the chances of powder residue would be very remote. Mr. Bellin, have you fired a bolt-action rifle at all before? Mr. Barnes, many times. Mr. Bellin asks, how close would the chamber be to the cheek, as if you would be looking through the sight of the gun? Mr. Barnes, several inches from the rear of the chamber. Mr. Bellin asked, would this have any effect on the paraffin test at all? Mr. Barnes, it sure would. Mr. Bellin, what about the telescopic sights? Would that push your face back further or not? Mr. Barnes, it would push it back even further. Bellin asks, would this have an effect on the paraffin test? Mr. Barnes, the further you get from the chamber, the less possibility of getting powder residue on it would be. Mr. Bellin, what did you do with these paraffin tests after you made them? Mr. Barnes answers that I placed them in a large manila envelope separately. Then Mr. Bellin asks, what did you do then? Mr. Barnes says, I walked out of Captain Fritz's office, and I had a couple of patrolmen trying to weave their way through the news media so that I could have walking room to get to the elevator to get back to the 4th floor, the ID bureau. And that was approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, I would say, approximately. Bellin, did Lee Harvey Oswald say anything to you as you were removing these casts that you remember? Mr. Barnes, very little other than what I repeated to you before, that he knew what I was trying to do and that I was wasting my time and that he didn't know anything about what we were accusing him of. Mr. Bellin, you then went up to the 4th floor of the lab, is that correct? Barnes, that's true. What did you do then? Mr. Barnes says, I initialed the cast, sealed them, and placed them in our locked evidence room. Where did they go after that? Mr. Barnes responds, they go to our city-county laboratory for analysis. Mr. Bellin, where is that city-county laboratory? Mr. Barnes answered, it's at Parkland Hospital. Bellin, do you know when they went there? Mr. Barnes answered, the following morning. Did you get the results from this analysis at all? Mr. Barnes says, the results were obtained by our bureau. I didn't get the results. Mr. Bellin asks, do you know what these results were? Mr. Barnes says, I understand. I haven't seen them personally, but I understand that they are positive, the ones of his hands. Mr. Bellin, by positive, you mean they showed the presence of nitrates. Mr. Barnes, they showed the presence of nitrates. Mr. Bellin, what about the one on the cheek? Mr. Barnes, the one on the cheek was negative. Mr. Bellin asks, were any conclusions made because of either positive results from the test on his hands or the negative results on the test of his cheek? Mr. Barnes says, in my own mind, I didn't expect any positive result from the cheek to start with, but to run down criticism and to satisfy the public and to show that the world that we tried to cover it very well, we did it for possibly any future, I don't know how to word it, any complaints that might come on later. Mr. Bellin, by complaints, you mean people that might, Mr. Barnes interjects, they might question why you did not or why you did do something this big. We felt like the public should know that we had done the best that we knew how. Mr. Bellin, even though you didn't expect to have results. Mr. Barnes, I didn't personally, and I am the one that made it. From my experience with paraffin casts and from my experience in shooting rifles, common sense will tell you that a man firing a rifle has got very little chance of getting powder residue on his cheek. Well, there you have it. Oswald tested negative on his cheek. No gunpowder or nitrates were measurable. Does this mean that he didn't fire a rifle? No. Before the assassination, the FBI conducted experiments showing the unreliability of paraffin tests. And here, the FBI, Cortland Cunningham, testified to this in front of the Warren Commission. And here's what the FBI determined about paraffin tests. Remember, this was before the assassination. It says 17 men were involved in this test. Each man fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber revolver. Both the firing hand and the hand that was not involved in the firing were treated with paraffin casts, and then those casts treated with diphenylamine. A total of 8 men showed negative or essentially negative results on both hands. A total of 3 men showed positive results on the idle hand, but negative on the firing hand. 2 men showed positive results on their firing hand and negative results on their idle hands. And 4 men showed positive on both hands after having fired only with their right hands. So it is evident that false positives and false negatives occur with revolvers. After the assassination, the Warren Commission directed the FBI to run the same experiment using the C-2766 rifle and ammunition, which was identical to what was found in the Texas Schoolbook Depository. Cunningham related the results of that experiment. And here's what he said. We fired the rifle. Mr. Killian fired it 3 times rapidly using similar ammunition so that to that used in the assassination. We reran the test both on cheek and both hands. This time we got a negative reaction on all casts. The questioner, Eisenberg, said, so to recapitulate, after firing the rifle rapid fire, no residues of any kind were picked off of Mr. Killian's cheek? And Cunningham said, that is correct. And there were none on the hands. We cleaned off the rifle again with dilute HCI and loaded it for him. He held it in one of the cleaned areas, and I pushed the clip in so he would not have to get his hands near the chamber. In other words, so he wouldn't pick up any residues from it, or from the action, or from the receiver. When we ran the casts, we got no reaction on either hand or on his cheek. On the controls, when he hadn't fired a gun all day, we got numerous reactions. So, Oswald also, we see, tested positive on both hands, but more so on his right hand. Does this mean that Oswald definitely fired a weapon? No. Why? Well, in this non-FBI publication called The Fundamentals of Criminal Investigation, the 5th edition, page 771, Charles O'Hara and Gregory O'Hara explain and note some problems with the paraffin test. They say the dermal nitrate paraffin gauntlet test is a procedure designed to determine whether a suspect has recently discharged a firearm. Melted paraffin is brushed over the shooting hand, and he goes on to explain what we just talked about a little while ago. The diethylamine reagent is prepared by adding 10 cubic centimeters of concentrated sulfuric acid and 2 millimeters of distilled water. To this, added 0.05 grams of diethylamine. The reagent is dropped on the paraffin mold with a pipette. Dark blue specks appearing on the inner surface of the cast indicate a positive reaction. Theoretically, the diethylamine reagent is used to test for the presence of nitrates, which are contained in the residue of gunpowder blown back on the hand in discharging the firearm. Here are the objections. There are several scientific objections to the test as described above in its simplest form. The role of the nitrate on the hand is that of an oxidizing agent. Other strong oxidizing agents can produce the same effect. Hence, launderers, chemists, pharmacists, and other persons handling bleaches or other oxidizing compounds may have material on their hands which would yield a positive reaction. Thus, the test does not necessarily indicate the presence of nitrates, but establishes merely that an oxidizing substance is present on the hand. In brief, the test is nonspecific. Another objection is concerned with the fact that there are many non-incriminating sources of nitrates, such as fertilizers, explosives, tobacco, urine, and cosmetics. Certain foods also contain nitrates. And finally, some experimenters have found that it is possible to obtain a negative reaction from the hand of a person who has recently fired many rounds of ammunition. Well, getting back to the opening question of this video, do you remember what the question was? Oswald's nitrates test. Did it prove anything? What would you say? The unbiased answer would probably be no. The dermal nitrate test performed on Oswald on the evening of November 22nd of the assassination proved neither guilt nor innocence in the murder of JFK and Officer J.D. Tippit. But let me close this video with just one caveat, one suspicion, one doubt that raises its ugly head in the form of a statement written in the final review of the nitrates test. Notice here on the screen, under the heading of results of the examination at the bottom of the page, notice what it says. No nitrates were found on Exhibit 1, and that's the cheek. Nitrate patterns consistent with the subject having discharged a firearm were present on Exhibits 2 and 3. And then notice this. The pattern on Exhibit 3 is typical of the patterns produced in firing a revolver. Now let's look at the pattern. Let's look at the photograph or the drawing of the hand and the pattern. We certainly see a pattern here. It's distinctive. It goes all across the fingers. And was that the pattern that the examiners were referring to in number 3, which is the right hand? Well, it certainly is a distinctive pattern. Do you think that this is the pattern left on Oswald's hand from the shooting of J.D. Tippit? Comment below on your thoughts. I would look forward to reading them. Until then, have a good day, and please subscribe if you haven't already, comment, and give us a thumbs up. Thank you for watching. Until next time, this is Glenn Sample saying goodbye.